Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 56. Today's guest is Chris Engman. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. This is our first show of the new year, first show of 2018. Actually, due to travel, I am recording this intro ahead of time, which I don't usually do. So for me, it's still 2017, and I have no idea what has happened in the couple of weeks between me recording this and you hearing it. Normally, I'd say, probably no big deal there. Nothing big probably happened, but these days we get so many news bombshells happening, on a Friday after work hours that, who even knows? Your guess, I guess, is as good as mine, or actually, I guess since you're listening to this in the future, your guess is better than mine. You don't even have to guess. Anyway, I hope the holidays went well for everyone. I hope that you had a safe and restful and happy time. I'm looking forward to the possibilities of a new year and hoping to make this year better than the last. There's a lot of work ahead, but I'm excited for it, and I'm interested to hear what you've got planned for 2018. So hop on Twitter and let me know at ChannelOpenPod. And of course, the first thing that I'm excited about for this year is today's conversation, which is with photographer Chris Engman. Chris is an artist based in Los Angeles, and his work focuses on the nature of photography and photographs and human perception, as well as themes like time, memory, and our experience of the environment. I first saw Chris's work at the Medium Festival several years ago when he was a presenting artist at the lectures there, and I was just blown away by the work, so I was very pleased to get the chance to talk with him. So let's jump in then, all right? As always, if you're on Twitter, you can use the hashtag ChannelOpenPod to join in the conversation. And now here's my conversation with Chris Engman. So how are you today?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I was really excited to talk with you. You were, I first became aware of your work through the Medium Festival when you came and spoke at the Medium Festival a few years ago. And I have to say, I've loved so many of the artist lectures at Medium, but yours is maybe the only one that I could legitimately say blew my mind.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you. And I'm glad. Yeah.
Yeah. There's something about your work I feel like has really stuck with me, and I think about it a lot, I find. Even though it's been, I think, you were there in 2015 or 14 maybe? Something like that?
I think 14. I'm not quite sure. It's been a minute. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think there's something about your work that I hadn't really ever thought about photography in the way that you presented it, and I think that's why it has stuck with me so much. So going through your website and sort of remembering what I remembered from your presentation. First of all, there was some new work there that I wasn't familiar with. Obviously, it's been a few years, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
And one of the things, the first things that I was thinking about with your work was, for a lot of your work, it seems to be very explicitly about the medium of photography, and often presented in what seems to me as like a visual puzzle, where there are things going on in the image that it's not necessarily completely obvious at first what's happening, but that you provide a lot of clues in the images as to what's sort of happening. And what I was sort of wondering, I know that this is kind of a broad question, but just to start with, was sort of what kind of experience do you hope that your audience will have with your images?
Well, I think I want to say that I don't know if I have any one answer to that, just because I tried to conceive of each piece to have a somewhat different effect. I definitely have the viewer in mind when I'm making things. Mm-hmm. I make them for me, first of all, but I do very much consider the tried to consider the experience of somebody coming cold to what for me is experienced as, sometimes 1 month, sometimes 2 or 3 month process of sort of constructing an idea and then making what are sometimes quite elaborate plans, and then a number of processes along the way that somehow I want to try to embed all of the above as much as possible within an image. So I sort of want to what extent I can, facilitate the experience of the viewer such that it bears some kind of resemblance to my own thought process and my own experience. So I want the viewer to have a sense of, you call them puzzles. To some extent, I want to recreate that experience for them that I have, which is, oh, okay, I want to do this thing. And, what are the 10 steps that have to happen to make this thing happen? And then each step has its own 10 steps and so on. And I sort of want to recreate that. Yeah, I want the viewer to think about photography. And ultimately, I want the viewer just to think about sight or vision and to sort of be put in the place where they have to question their assumptions about how that works. I know that's something that motivates me. That's something that I like to do, is to make something that in the process of making it, and hopefully also after the fact in the print, causes me to be confronted with some of my assumptions about how I see. So I want the viewer to have an experience of that too.
I remember one of the points that you made several times in your presentation at Medium, and it shows up in your artist statements as well, is about how images lie. Which is something that obviously I think maybe we're getting to the point now where sort of the general lay public is starting to have a little bit more of a sophisticated understanding of photographs and how the photograph is different from the subject of the photograph.
Yeah.
But there's still so much room for that understanding to become even more sophisticated, and just the way that your photographs challenge the viewer in that way is something that, I don't know, I just think about it all the time.
Oh, well, I thank you. That really pleases me. For one thing, but so thank you. But yeah, we're in an interesting place with our relationship to photography, which of course is evolving and has been evolving since it was invented. I think that sometimes when I tell people, without getting into it, I make images that make you question your perceptions, one response might be to a skeptic of that idea might be, we all know that images lie to us now. So case closed. We don't trust images. But I don't really think that's true. I think it's far more complicated than that. I think that we need to bring a different set of criteria to evaluate any given image. So we have a certain set of assumptions for, journalistic images, and that actually might be different whether it's from online or on Facebook or the New York Times, or in print or on the screen. But in general, with journalistic photography, we expect, and more so the more reputable the news source, but I would say that more or less we still trust that those images are true in the sense that they haven't been radically altered. Mm-hmm. And that's clearly important to good journalists, that they're true in at least in the sense, in the very limited sense, admittedly, that the camera saw a thing and the photographer reacted subjectively to what he or she was seeing and made a record. So we have an artifact, which is never completely objective, but is at least not lying in the sense that heavily manipulated images can lie. They can, just blatantly reinvent what was or wasn't there, or make it seem like in the case of sort of performative photography, like something was done, but it wasn't. And so I just find it to be a really rich area to mine. And some people would say the debate is over. Photos, we don't believe them anymore. But my experience refutes that. And certainly my experience with people engaging with my photography and others as well who ask these questions. I'm certainly not the only one asking them.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find so fascinating about your photography is that I think most people, when they talk about not trusting images, it does sort of come down to that question of whether it's journalism or, maybe editorial portraiture, fashion photography, something like that. The question is more, has the image been manipulated? Has it been photoshopped? That is a question that people are sort of used to asking now. Whereas your work doesn't engage with that really. Your work, as you say in I've read some of your interviews. You've got some snippets here and there on your website where you talk about how your photographs are more or less straight. There are some instances, you say, where you do sort of digitally manipulate some of the images, but not to hide what the sort of essential truth of the image is. That part of it would be presented straight. And so rather than engaging with the question of has this image been manipulated, you're really pushing against the sort of boundaries of how we perceive even a straight photograph, which I think that's where the real, fascination comes from. It's sort of a philosophically different question.
Yeah, good. Well, as you're suggesting, I think that even straight photography is manipulated. You choose your lens, you choose your point of view, you choose what to include, what not to include in so many ways. Objective photography is just not something that is really possible. Yeah, I think that some of the work also sort of plays on our expectations in the sense that they look like things that could have been sort of dropped in digitally. And then sometimes I'll have an idea for an image and I actually want to just do it digitally, and then the fun and the interest for me comes in, well, what if I found a way to do this manually? And then people might see it and expect that something heavily digital was done, and it's quite the opposite. So in that sense, I am reacting to the fact that of digital and how that's sort of changed the landscape.
Yeah, there's a quote that you put on your website where you were I forget who you were talking to, but I have it written down here. You said, many photographers are finding ways to make their work be less work, while I've gone in the opposite direction. My photographs are labored, they don't take shortcuts, and in that sense, I'm like a sculptor or an installation artist who uses photography as a tool. I thought that was really interesting, and I know that from your presentation, and you've mentioned it today as well, that your photographs are very labor-intensive and they take a long time to create. One of the things I was sort of wondering in that is whether what's important to you as the artist is the experience of that labor, of making the piece, and how much is the finished piece itself. Like, how much is the labor there only in service of the final piece, and how much do you consider the labor to be part of the work?
Yeah. I guess sometimes this is asked, is the art the final image, or is the art the process? I don't know if I have an answer for that question. I don't know if it really matters, but I'm definitely very invested in both. I hope that's not a cop-out. I can't say either or, because I suppose on some level I'm making these hard for some reason. I do enjoy the late labor, but I often, when I think of a project, I think, oh, good, this is a relatively easy one. This will take, less time, be less physically challenging, be less logistically challenging or tedious. Sometimes, to be honest, there are moments there are periods that are fairly tedious in this process. But usually as I get into a project, I realize how much more complicated it is actually to execute than I originally assumed. And I mean, this happens with such regularity that I have to assume that on some level I sort of crave that, and to get into just a rhythm with the work. And then of course, so there's the work, and then there's also the traveling. A lot of these are either shot outdoors or in a combination of outdoors and indoors. So I have to travel a lot for that process, and end up spending a lot of time outdoors in that process. On one level, the whole way I've constructed my practice in my life might just be an excuse to go camping a lot. I sometimes wonder, but it definitely, no, not exactly, but it definitely has that benefit for me. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the things, as you mentioned, a lot of your pieces are shot outdoors, or in the case of some of the newer pieces, it's almost like you're taking the outdoors and bringing them indoors.
Yeah.
One of the pieces that I was thinking of sort of in this context was one that I wasn't familiar with, even though it appears to be one of your older pieces just from how it's positioned on your website, was I think it's called Dissipation.
Yeah.
And where this is one of the few images, really the only image presented on your website at least, where there is text integral to the images. You present a diptych taken almost 70 years apart, at the same location, and then you have handwritten text presented underneath the two images. And it's very clear from the text that this location has personal meaning to you. And I feel like I remember you talking about something similar with your images, The Claim, how this place also has a certain personal meaning to you. And I was sort of wondering, since so much of your work is presented in these outdoor locations, how much the specific places are important to the piece, and how much maybe personal attachment you have to those specific places, and how much that factors into why that image might be important for you to make.
Yeah. Yeah. So something that happens is that if I go to a place and make something in that place, with few exceptions, that place then becomes pretty special to me. So I'm looking at that image now, and can I plug my website?
Sure, yeah, of course.
It's chrisengman.com. And I say that because I'm looking at the image now as we talk about it, because I really don't enjoy talking about my own work unless it's in front of me. So if anybody wants to follow along.
Yeah, I'll make sure that there's links in the show notes to all the images that we talk about. So, yeah.
Okay. Oh, good. So yeah, I'm looking at that image now, and on the top image, first of all, I'll say about this image that admittedly it's pretty derivative as a piece, because Mark Klett basically did very similar stuff. So I don't claim this piece to be highly original. I have to add that caveat. But I just couldn't stop myself from doing it because, I went through, my grandma has these old, well, they're in my possession now, but these old photographs that my great grandfather took. And it's just albums and albums of them. He died when I was 2, so I don't remember him. But it was extremely strange to go through the albums and find so many of the places that he was attracted to, that he went to, evidently, I was very attracted to. So, kind of weird things, like after I made the piece Ode, which is a ladder kind of extending into nowhere on the beach. After I made that, I looked through the album and I found a image of a boat with a giant tower that looks kind of like mine coming out of the back of it, which is almost even weirder because I have no idea I mean, mine was meant to be a functionless, object activity. And, his was sort of seemingly even more so, although it probably has a purpose. I just have no idea what that might have been. And I also found pictures of what I think is Larsen Bay, which is this cannery in Alaska, which you can only go in with a boat or with an airplane. There's no roads. And I found this place amongst his photos after I had just spent a summer working there as a fisherman and then as a cannery, as a fish hatchery worker. So weird stuff like that. And and then I had been working for 3 or 4 years. I'm looking now at the dissipation photo that you brought up, and on the top photo, you see 2 shadows of figures, and then a lake, which is down inside of a canyon, and just above that is a piece of land where I made, in a span of about 10 years, on and off working there, probably 15 pieces. And so I found this, and it's just so bizarre and thrilling to me that I knew exactly where it was, and the next time I was out there, I made this. Yeah, but yeah,
it's so interesting to me because I feel like this photograph sort of unlocked something for me about maybe how to experience other pieces of your work, where so much of what you talked about in your medium presentation had to do with things that struck me as very cerebral and no less impressive for being cerebral, but, very sort of intellectual about how we perceive, how we actually literally see things in either planes or in 3 dimensions, how the photograph can be manipulated without actually being manipulated in a way that we would think. Those are ideas that, to me, although they have emotional resonance, that I approach them more like a puzzle, right? And so there's a satisfaction and there's a wow moment to it as well, an aha moment. But it wasn't a primarily emotional experience, whereas this photograph sort of had that emotion to it, sort of more right on the surface of it. I mean, maybe literally right on the surface of it because of the text. But then after having seen that image, coming back to some of your other images, and then also reading some of the writing that you've done in statements for those images, for example, Dust to Dust, which for the listeners, this is, I'll put a link in the show notes, but this is an image where you've taken first you've constructed a mound of gravel and then rotated it, but shot it in such a way that you've not only completely reconstructed this mound of gravel, but then also shot it at exactly the right time of day so that the shadows are all exactly the same, and it appears that it's the landscape that has rotated and nothing else, which, just as a technical feat, the ability to do that is, mind-boggling to me. The amount of attention to detail and toil that would involve is just really striking. And that's sort of how I had initially come to it. But then talking about how this piece is, in your statement, you talk about this piece being about, in some sense, ephemerality and matter being borrowed, and in some sense about mortality. This isn't something that I hadn't really engaged with it on those levels, even though I had read that statement before.
Yeah.
And I felt like this other piece was what really unlocked it for me.
Oh, that's great. They are, on one level, puzzles, I suppose, although I do a little bit recoil at that.
I apologize.
No characterizations. No, I understand. You're not the only one. And it's okay with me. That's good that's one way to think about them, for sure. And they are that for me too, but I mean, you're exactly right. Sometimes I'm photographing gravel or cinder blocks, and I'm talking about perception, and I like to quote French theorists, and sometimes if I'm in the right mood. But it really is an emotional process for me. I mean, when I made this piece, it just seemed, it's, it's such an absurd thing to do on one level, right? It's so mundane. I mean, the material is gravel. And I'm doing this on, on the one hand, kind of utterly useless thing, like kind of brazenly useless thing. I'm rotating rocks. And it's partly about that futility. It's not only about the futility. Hopefully, it gets elevated by the gesture of what it is that's happening that you already described. But I went into it for sure with the intention to meditate on impermanence. So I'm making this happen, and it's a days long process, weeks long if you include searching for a site. And while I'm driving and looking for a place, and then while I'm executing it and thinking about how incredibly absurd it is, but on the other hand, how very beautiful it is that this is possible, to know and then calculate the position of the sun over different days and different times of day with such accuracy that I could recreate this pile and have the shadows correspond, right? Mm. So to make it, I'm going online and finding sites that will give you calculations for where will the sun be and how will this work, and then I'm figuring out how to draw a chart on the ground that I can use as reference points, and I had 3 or 4 other kind of reference points just to make it happen. And then dust to dust. So I wanted one effect to be that, for example, one might look at it and at first glance think that the pile hasn't changed, but the landscape's changed. That maybe that pile was just there for enough millions of years that the mountains in the background have actually eroded away, right? Mm. So in that sense too, it's about impermanence and things changing, which is in fact true. If you stand in this position where the camera was for long enough, that hill in the background will be gone, which is just mind blowing. Of course.
I guess. I certainly don't mean to, I hope it didn't come across as belittling in any way to refer to these as puzzles, but.
No, not at all. No.
I guess what I mean by that is that the ideas involved with the technique of creating these images were so impressive to me that I sort of focused on that, sort of more to the exclusion of this more emotional side to it. But then I'm actually so glad, I'm glad to talk to you in general, but having the opportunity again to revisit the work and having this completely different experience of viewing it, I feel very fortunate to have had that opportunity. It was pretty amazing.
Well, good, and I'm glad you're bringing these things up. It's possible to engage with them on an purely intellectual level, or to see them and feel like, wow, but there is so much going on, besides that, that's ultimately, more interesting to me.
I felt like, originally I was thinking about asking you something about, I decided I didn't like this question, but originally I was thinking about something along the lines of how much explanation might be needed to find your way into some of these photographs. But yeah. I decided I didn't like that question, mainly because I think with most of them that if you sit with them long enough, you can get there without any additional explanation. Maybe not in the specifics of, for example, in Dust to Dust, in your accompanying statement, you talk about something like how that gravel may now be incorporated into someone's home, and that you find that idea comforting. That specific image might not occur to you coming from just the image, but so much of it is, the rest of it is in there without anything else. One of the things that I did sort of think about along those lines is, this is going to be maybe a sort of a large topic, but I was thinking about your images of pieces like skew or double skew. And so these are images where and within this series, you're presenting photographs that look a certain way, that sort of invite the viewer to see them as though the image is either viewed, shot at an angle when in fact it's not, or that it's shot straight on when it's actually at an angle because of the way that you've constructed these objects. But I remember when you were talking about this in your presentation, it seemed like a big part of this was also in how they were presented, as objects on the wall. And I kind of felt like, if you only are viewing these online, that you're losing some information there. And so there was a sort of frustration that I felt and I felt sort of hampered by viewing many of these images online. And so I kind of wondered, like, how much is the object, the print or the experience of that object, how much of that do you feel is integral to the work, and how much do you feel like still, like, when presented in a different form, like online, is still there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, I completely agree. They're difficult to engage with online. They're difficult to engage with, in other words, as a image of the work. They're difficult to document because these works, I called this body of work ink on paper. Mm-hmm. And they feel a certain way in person, which is really hard to capture and then show. I often find that, I mean, I've had several people say they saw these online and they just didn't get it, and then saw one in person, and then you sort of feel the sort of physical impact of them, and you can walk around it. Some of them are partly about what happens when you walk around them. So in that sense, they're probably photos first, but sculpture is like a close second. If not, they might even be more so sculptures, some of them, than photos. And I never thought I'd say that about my work, but in this case, I think it might be true. So, yeah, did that answer any of the...
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that I sort of think about is because your work draws so much attention to the distinction, especially this body of work, draws so much attention to the difference between a three-dimensional object and the flat plane of a photograph. But that I feel like there is something even extra about the idea of looking at some of these photographs online, that there's some sort of ontological difference between these two experiences.
Yeah.
But I haven't quite been able to get my arms around it, but I feel like there's even something interesting about that, you know?
Yeah, it's simultaneously frustrating for me that I don't have a better way to document these, but it also is I kind of feel like they succeed because I made something that can't be reproduced and put online to my satisfaction. You know, you make a painting, you take a picture of it. Sometimes even it looks better as a picture, in my opinion. Some paintings do. Most, hopefully not, right? But sometimes they look better as pictures. A quote-unquote standard picture, or even any of my photos that aren't in this particular body of work, you know, you can click on them and you sort of understand okay, well, the print looks something like this, but this is on a screen and that's a different experience. And we have a lot of experience with looking at images of photos online and then understanding how to translate that in our minds to what it would it look like in person, right?
Mm.
You can say that about any of these except for the ink on paper series, and you just and the translation is not it fails in the case of these works.
Mm.
Yeah, because they exist in a space, so just to describe maybe one of them, there's a whole series of these actually that are essentially a piece of photographic paper pinned to a wall with a frame put around it, and then I photograph all of that, the frame and the paper, and then make a print of that, and the print includes the inside of the frame. And then when you assemble it, you have this sort of situation where everything is doubled. Mm. So you have the chance to directly compare object and image and object. Mm. So you have the paper, which exists as you're standing in the gallery looking at one of these things hanging on the wall. You have the paper, which exists inside of the image. So you have a representation of paper, but then you have the physical paper standing there that you could walk up and touch. Mm. So you have paper existing as both things, which is very sort of ontologically strange. Yeah, and then you have the image of the frame and the frame, the object of the frame, and together they look so similar that it's easy to mistake what it is that you're seeing. And, that's part of the fun, I think, and part of the impact of these is that, hopefully, eventually you'll figure out what it is you're seeing, but the work tries to still keep you in this limbo where even though intellectually you feel that it might be something else. And then, of course, you have the image of the wall to compare to the wall, which is around the framed photograph in the gallery or in the home or museum or whatever. And so then the piece starts to expand out and include the environment. And then lastly, in the case of these works, you have a repeated lighting situation. So you have a photograph of a shadow, many shadows really, but the strongest one being a band across the top, which would be the frame created by the top lip of the shadow created by the top lip of the frame. And then you have that image of a shadow to compare to the real shadow, which is also kind of a non-thing. So there's that strangeness. Mm. So yeah, I think that the difficulty in experiencing them online and the difference between that and in real life is kind of echoes the difficulty or disorientation that some people experience when they see them in the gallery. Mm-hmm. But ultimately they're hopefully, I think, far more satisfying in the gallery.
Well, I've got like about 1 million more questions, but we should probably wrap this section up and then come back and do the second segment. So we'll just take a quick little break. So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which can be whatever you'd like to talk about, anything that's on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Okay, well, I was originally going to talk about prospect and refuge theory, but I decided on something much lighter. I wanted to talk about driving.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what about driving would you like to talk about?
Okay. Well, I love driving. Are you in, you're based in San Diego, Mike, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm originally from Northern California, but I've lived in San Diego for almost 13 years now.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I've lived in LA for 6 years, and one of the reasons I came to LA, well, the much larger reason for coming to LA was to attend graduate school at USC, but I liked the idea of LA in part because it's a car metropolis.
That's sort of the opposite of what most people say about LA.
I know. Well, when I was in Seattle, before graduate school, in addition to being an artist, I was supplementing my income as a part-time bus driver. And, I just loved driving the bus. And I mean, it was a fun job. It was pretty easy. You pick up passengers and you drop them off. And once you've dropped them off, oftentimes there's a period when you drop off your last passenger, you get to the end of the route and you have to go back to the beginning, or you go back to the base. You end up spending about a third of your time out on the roads on a bus, alone in the bus. And I did that for about 4 years, and might sound strange, but I would say that during those 4 years, the majority of my ideas about new works happened while I was driving the bus without any passengers in it. Yeah, my theory about that is that driving occupies a certain amount of attention, of conscious attention, but there's enough left to sort of consciously be considering some topic. In my case, often my photos kind of come to me in a very mysterious way as sort of images, shapes or colors or shadows. It's sort of a mystery to me how those sort of strange images kind of add up to, oh, and now I'm making this piece. I'm never quite sure how I got to an idea, only that I kind of have dreams, or I have these images, and then they add up to something in the end. And anyway, when you're driving, I can kind of directly think consciously about an idea about perception, or about vision, or about photography, or something about prospect refuge theory. But then you have to use some of your conscious energy staying within the lines and being safe, and then as a result, your unconscious kind of takes over and starts to do some magic on whatever it is that you're trying to think about. And so yeah, it's just something that I found that really works for me.
That's really interesting. It's almost like when it's dark outside, and you can if you look right at something when it's dark, it's harder to see than if you sort of move your eyeballs so that you're looking in your peripheral vision.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I actually find something very similar happens to me, that I've been thinking about a short story, because I'm a writer in addition to being a photographer.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this short story for like 6 months now, and the time that I most often will actually have lines of text come into my mind is when I'm driving home from work at night. I've got about a 15-minute drive home from work.
Yeah.
And it's that time between when I leave the office and when I pull into my driveway that for some reason I'm at my most creative. But the difficulty, of course, is that I'll have an idea, but then I don't have any way to write it down because I need all my hands for the car.
Yeah. That's interesting. But I think that can work. Maybe it's different for writing than it is for what I'm engaged in. But I find that kind of works in my favor too, because obviously I'm not going to construct one of my photographs while I'm driving.
Right.
And so if an image is coming to me and seems to be meaningful, I kind of have this feeling like, oh, that's something. The piece Object Shadow actually came from a shadow of a sign that I passed under a streetlight while I was driving. And then weeks later I realized what I wanted to make. But I think that the inability to sort of write it down maybe means that it has to live kind of in the gray matter in a mysterious way in your mind without taking shape, without taking, form or being kind of complete. Anyway, it stays there, and it's kind of like an incubator.
Yeah, it is. I think, too, another thing that happens is just that, for me at least, when I'm driving is one of the times when I'm sort of forced to be present to some degree. And that I think that has a lot to do with people always talk about creative flow states that are always so elusive if you're trying to get to them on purpose, that you almost have to sort of trick your brain into getting there. And so having something like a driving where you're sort of forced to come at things, because have to pay attention consciously to something else that might, just like as you're saying, free up some cycles in your brain processing to come at it a different way. It's very interesting. I do find that if I have trouble remembering the details of something by the time I get home, I still might sort of have the outline of it, and the ones that end up going somewhere are often the ones where if over repeated nights coming home, I maybe the next week I might have the same idea or something that feels the same. Those are the ones that end up, if they're important enough to my subconscious mind to keep coming up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's kind of a filter. If it wasn't a good enough idea, it won't stick with you.
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
I've been going on road trips for my work. When I lived in Seattle, I would make things and then drive them out to eastern Washington State. So it was about a 4-hour drive each way. So it kind of, for me, kind of started happening then. And now, sometimes for example, if I have a show, which I just did a couple months ago, I'll spend a lot of time driving just to kind of see new things and experience new things, and also just to try to get into that space that we're talking about. So I just went to Sedona, Arizona, and then I drove up to Oak Creek Canyon, which is on I think it's the 169, and did some shooting, and then up to Flagstaff. I went to Lowell Observatory, and I went to the Grand Canyon. And I came back feeling pretty refreshed and pumped about making some new things. It's it works.
Yeah. Another thing I often go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead.
I was just going to say another thing, you mentioned Sedona that sort of made pop into my head, that another thing that often I respond to when I'm on a long car drive is the landscape itself, because I'm being presented something, even if most of the time when I'm driving, I'm going to familiar places. Like I might be driving back up to my home area up north, and we usually take the same route when we do that. So I'm familiar with the route, but it's not a visual scene that I see every day. Something about having that difference and having the landscape present for me in a way, especially because the landscape while I'm actually driving is something that I can respond to but not actually capture in the moment. I would have to pull over, and usually I don't have time to pull over, and sometimes there isn't even a place to pull over.
Yeah.
But there's something sort of fertile about that space, I feel like.
Yeah, it sure is, especially in a place like, I like the highways, but I really like the small roads like through Nevada, where it's 2 lanes, and if I'm in the mood for it, I'll just turn off all the music and all the podcasts and just trying to think about nothing except for my body moving through space and the radical environment that it is out there, the vast spaces and how the background changes over time versus how the middle ground changes versus how the foreground changes. I mean, that in itself as a kind of just meditation is sort of enough to keep me interested. Before I left on my trip. I took a lift home from somewhere, and I left my phone in the lift, and it took me about a day to figure out how to get it back from the Lyft driver. Never leave your phone in Lyft because, for one thing, you can't call Lyft. You have to go online and then they'll call you. But if you don't have a phone, then they can't call you. Yeah. So I was able to try to call them with the computer, but they couldn't call my computer. They could only call my phone, which doesn't do me any good. Anyway, it was a bit of an ordeal, but the whole time I was thinking, well, I leave tomorrow. If I don't have my phone, I'm still going. And so I started to think about what it would be like to travel without my phone, which of course is what I used to do all the time. And in thinking about that, I realized how different the experience of a road trip has become or even just driving through LA, with my phone. So I spent the first day without my phone, and I had no news, I had no podcasts, not even any music. And then I brought an old school Rand McNally map with me. And so I had no idea how long it was going to take to get from place A to place B. And I was kind of shocked to see how different of an experience that was, and actually more conducive to this thing that we're talking about, this sort of meditative state or the creative flow state. So it's definitely something I've decided to reintroduce to my driving practice, if you can call it that. It's hard. I find it sometimes hard to describe to people why I like driving so much. And I was thinking about it, and I actually I thought of one quote and then one sort of synopsis of people because people in LA have written about it, right? It's such a thing here. And there's that Rayner Banham quote from, what's it called? Architecture of Four Ecologies, where he says, "I learned to drive in order to read Los Angeles in the original." Do you know that quote?
No, I never heard that before.
It's so good. He says, as though you would learn Italian to read Dante. You can't understand Los Angeles until you get a car. So Rayner Banham comes to LA. I think it was in the 60s. I'm not sure. And he's walking around, and he's taking buses, and he kind of hates it. And then he realizes, you have to get a car to sort of understand the layout of things and the architecture and the logic. Once he gets a car, he loves it. And then the other thing I thought about is in Joan Didion, there is I think it's in Play It As It Lays. I didn't think about it till this morning, so I didn't have a chance to look it up, but there's a really beautiful passage where I think she's having some kind of, life crisis, and she, or rather the character, there's a particular place where you enter a freeway, I think on the left, and then there's 5 lanes, and if you want to take the next exit on the right, you have to cross 4 lanes of traffic. So as her kind of meditation or whatever it is, it serves some kind of function for her. She would she would go onto she would just do that in a loop. And so she would enter on the left, and then she would cross 4 lanes of traffic, and then she would exit on the right, and then she had some way, maybe it was 10 miles, maybe it was 5 miles, where she'd do a big loop and then come back and then get to do it again. And she would just do that all day. And her idea was to try to get from all the way to the left to all the way to the right, without once, I think, having to use either her brakes or change her accelerator. So like a perfect movement or something through the city in your big guzzling metal box. And I just I think that's one of the nicest lines that I've ever come across in or passages in literature. For me, that really resonates. I'm not even sure if I know why, but I totally get that.
There is something really, the idea of a perfect or maybe perfectly efficient motion through space, whether it's something you're doing with your hands or something you're doing with your body or something that you're doing maybe even with your car, there is something that seems really satisfying about that to me, maybe even sort of zen about it.
Yeah. I mean, it comes, you know what, you're saying this and I'm realizing, it also happens if you're doing sort of production work in carpentry or this kind of thing. You get, there's sort of a rhythm and you're kind of after some kind of mundane perfection.
Yeah. Well, so the last question that I like to ask everyone before we close is whether there is a piece of art or literature or just general creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yeah. Let's do Prospect and Refuge.
Okay.
It's involved, but I'll give you the short version. It is a book that I read, I think, 2 years ago, but had more impact on me than I think anything I'd read in a long time. It's Jay Appleton, and the book is called Experience of Landscape. And in it, he talks about prospect and refuge as being two of our most deep-rooted and sort of fundamental desires that end up affecting which kinds of places we like and dislike and find comfortable or threatening. And that can be, that's applicable to sort of architecture, so interior spaces, or also landscapes, or also, he says, has a role in how we evaluate or what the effect of painting is. He talks about sort of romantic painting or something, but any kind of painting, I would say that this theory would have something to say about, and or photography, or any art really. But it seems to me like such a great theory and underknown or underused. But the prospect in this formulation is a place which would seem to offer some kind of prospect, some kind of promise of sex or food or adventure or opportunity. And then refuge is something that would suggest, a place that would suggest that it would keep us safe, a place of calm, a place to think, a place to be happy perhaps, or to meditate. So he uses the example of a bunny on the edge of a field, and the bunny he won't be in the middle of the field looking for the mouse that he's trying to feast on. Because he might get feasted on himself by an eagle or something. So he'll wait on the edge of the field and maybe hide under some tall grasses so that the eagle can't see him, but he can see the mice that might come by. So this is a place that the rabbit likes. And so my recent work is about that in part, but it also just kind of shakes me up and makes me think differently about all kinds of things. Even driving, I realized this morning I made this connection that being in a car and then driving through vast landscape of Nevada, and you're the nearest person could be 100 miles away for all you know, is a kind of experience of prospect and refuge, because you have the adventure, you have the view, and you're moving very quickly through it. But you also have, your little box that you're in, and you're safe there. And so even I think the aesthetics of driving can be thought of through the lens of this really wonderful theory.
Cool. Well, that sounds pretty amazing. I'll have to learn more about that. I really appreciate you taking the time and talking with me. I had a really good time. I just wished I had more time. So, coming up in October 2018, there will be a couple of opportunities to see Chris's work in person, and as you heard, that's a key part of the experience. First, he will have a solo show at the Pasadena Museum of California Art, which will be a survey of his entire artistic career, and then he will also be participating in the Photo Focus Biennial in Cincinnati that same month. Oh, and one more thing. I talked with Chris a little bit after we were done recording, and he wanted me to mention that he had meant to acknowledge the environmental impact of driving, which is an issue that he does have a lot of concern about, and that for the sake of the planet, he hopes that we'll find another way to get around soon. And that is our show. If you have any questions or comments, you can hit me up via email at podcast@keepthechannelopen.com. You can also follow me and the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. If you'd like the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. That helps new listeners find the show. And if you'd like to support the show financially, check out our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's patreon.com/sakeriver, sake like the drink, and river like river. A monthly pledge in any amount will not only get you my undying appreciation, but also gets you access to the show a day early. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We'll be back on January 17th talking with one of my favorite landscape photographers, Lisa M. Robinson, so be sure to come back for that. Until then, remember, keep the channel open.